Welcome back. Tonight I'm reading Chapter 6 from Fiddler on the Roof. The village wakes after the wedding glow. Boundaries are tested, and a decree arrives that tilts every future. I'll keep the pace soft and steady while we trace love, duty, and the first steps toward exile. Chapter 6, The Unraveling of Certainties. The days following Zeitel's wedding possessed that peculiar quality of aftermath that characterizes periods succeeding great emotional expenditure, a kind of exhausted tranquility in which ordinary life resumes its customary patterns while bearing the invisible weight of recent transformation, like a landscape that appears unchanged after an earthquake, yet carries within its depths the memory of violent rearrangement. I found myself moving through my daily routines, the pre-dawn rising, the loading of milk cans onto my ancient cart, the careful navigation of Anatevka's rutted streets with a mechanical precision that suggested normalcy, while my mind churned with the complexity of changes both accomplished and impending. It was on the third morning after the wedding, as I made my rounds through the village with the dedication of one who understands that life's continuity depends more upon mundane repetition than upon dramatic gestures, that I encountered Fedka. He stood at the crossroads between the Jewish and Christian quarters, a geographical location that seemed symbolically appropriate given his position in my daughter's life, neither fully within our world nor entirely outside it, occupying that dangerous liminal space where boundaries blur and definitions become negotiable. "Reb Tevye," he said, and there was something in his manner, a combination of determination and deference that suggested he had been waiting for this encounter, had perhaps orchestrated it with the careful planning of a chess master, positioning pieces for an inevitable endgame. "Fedka," I replied, attempting to maintain the careful neutrality that our situation demanded, while every paternal instinct within me screamed warnings of danger, of boundaries about to be crossed, of traditions about to be shattered with the casual violence of ignorance or intention. "I would like to speak with you," he said, and the formality of his phrasing could not disguise the tremor in his voice, that betrayal of emotion that revealed the young man beneath the scholar's composed exterior. "About your daughter, about Kava." The milk cans on my cart rattled as my horse, sensing perhaps my sudden tension, shifted nervously in his traces. The morning sun, which had been climbing the eastern sky with its customary indifference to human drama, seemed to pause in its ascent, casting long shadows that stretched between us, like the visual manifestation of all that separated our worlds. "There is nothing to discuss," I said, though even as the words emerged I recognized their futility. One might as well attempt to halt the spring floods with declarations of prohibition, to prevent the sunrise with theological argument. "My daughter is not for you." "With respect, Reb Tevye," he said, and there was something in his voice now that hadn't been there before, a steel beneath the silk of his courtesy. "Shouldn't that be for Kava to decide?" The question hung in the morning air, like a challenge to everything I had believed, everything I had been taught, everything that had sustained our people through centuries of persecution and exile. The very suggestion that my daughter might have autonomy in such matters, might choose her own path regardless of tradition, family, faith. It was simultaneously liberating and terrifying, like standing at the edge of a precipice and feeling both the urge to jump and the desperate need to retreat to solid ground. "You speak," I said slowly, each word requiring careful consideration, "of decisions as though they exist in isolation, as though one person's choice doesn't affect entire communities, entire histories. My daughter's decision, if such a thing were even conceivable, would not be hers alone. It would be a decision for all her ancestors who died, rather than abandon their faith, for all her descendants who would be lost to us, for every member of our community who would see in her choice a crack in the wall that protects us from dissolution. Or perhaps, Fyetka countered with the passionate certainty of youth that has read much but lived little, they would see in her choice the possibility of bridges rather than walls, of connection rather than separation, of a future where love matters more than the accident of birth, into one tradition or another. Love, I repeated, and the word tasted bitter on my tongue, like medicine that might cure or poison depending on the dosage. You think love conquers all? That it's sufficient foundation for a life? Let me tell you something about love, young man. Love is wonderful in songs and stories, but life is not a song, and we are not characters in a story. We are real people living in a real world where real consequences follow from our choices. Your love, if that's what this is, would cost my daughter everything. Her family, her community, her very identity. And what if she considers that price worth paying? He asked quietly. The question struck me with the force of physical blow. I thought of Kava, my quiet one, my reader, my dreamer, and tried to imagine her making such a choice, stepping outside everything she had known into a future that offered no guarantees, except isolation from all that had previously defined her. The image was simultaneously impossible and terrifyingly, entirely plausible. Then she would be making that choice based on incomplete information, I said finally. She sees only the romance, not the reality. She imagines only the beginning, not the long years that follow when romance fades and reality remains. What happens when your families reject you? When your children belong to neither world? When the very love you thought would sustain you becomes a source of mutual recrimination? Fyetka was quiet for a long moment, and in his silence I heard not defeat, but contemplation, as though he were genuinely considering my words, rather than simply waiting for his turn to argue. When he spoke again, his voice carried a different quality, softer, more uncertain, but somehow more dangerous for its vulnerability. I know the risks, he said. I've thought of nothing else for weeks. But Reb Tevye, I also know what I feel when I'm with her. The way she sees the world, the way her mind works, the way she can find meaning in a phrase that I've read a dozen times without understanding. She makes me better than I am alone. And I believe, I hope, I do the same for her. Isn't that worth something? Isn't that worth everything? Before I could respond, before I could marshal the arguments that tradition and wisdom and fear provided in abundance, I heard a voice that froze the blood in my veins. Papa. Kava stood a few feet away, having approached with that silent grace that had always characterized her movements. How long had she been listening? How much had she heard? Her face bore an expression I had never seen before, a mixture of defiance and pleading, strength and vulnerability, child and woman existing simultaneously in the same features. Kava, I said, and her name emerged as both greeting and warning, acknowledgement and prohibition. I was looking for you, she said, though we all knew this was not entirely true. She had been looking for this moment, this confrontation, this opportunity to bring into the light what had been developing in shadow. Mama needs you at home. "I'll come immediately," I said, though I made no move to leave. The three of us stood there, frozen in a tableau that contained within it all the tension of our situation: the father, the daughter, the outsider who threatened to become something more. Each of us understanding that we were balanced on the edge of something irreversible. "We've been reading together," Kava said suddenly, the words emerging in a rush, as though she had been holding them back by main force and could no longer contain them. "Just reading, discussing books, ideas. Is that so terrible? Is the exchange of thoughts across boundaries such a threat to everything you hold dear?" "It's not the reading," I said, though we all knew it was not about reading at all. "It's what the reading leads to, what it represents, what it makes possible." "What it makes possible," she repeated, and there was wonder in her voice, as though she were discovering the phrase's meaning even as she spoke it. "Yes, exactly. It makes possible understanding between people who are supposed to be strangers. It makes possible connection where there should be only division. It makes possible love where there should be none." I finished for her, and the word hung between us like an admission of what we all knew but had been unwilling to name. "Is love something that should be confined by should and shouldn't?" Fyedka asked, and I could hear in his voice that he was not arguing now, but genuinely seeking understanding. "Is it something we can control with rules and boundaries? Or is it like the wind, going where it will regardless of our attempts to direct it?" "The wind," I said, grasping at the metaphor like a drowning man grasping at rope, "can be destructive as well as refreshing. It can tear down houses, destroy crops, scatter communities. We build walls not because we hate the wind, but because we understand its power. And sometimes," Kava said quietly, "walls that protect also imprison." The philosophical complexity of our argument might have continued indefinitely, each of us defending positions that were simultaneously reasonable and impossible, but we were interrupted by the arrival of Golda, who appeared on the street with the sudden materialization that wives perfect when they sense their husbands are engaged in something requiring immediate intervention. "Tevye," she said, and in the pronunciation of my name, I heard volumes of meaning, warning, summons, recognition of the danger we were all dancing around. "You're needed at home, now." I looked at my wife, this woman who had stood beside me through everything, who had borne my children and my moods with equal patience, who understood without explanation the nature of the crisis we faced. Then I looked at my daughter, seeing in her face the plea she could not voice, the question she dared not ask, the love she could not deny. "Come, Kava," I said finally. "Your mother needs us." She hesitated for a moment, her eyes meeting Fyedka's in a glance that contained entire conversations, then followed us, her steps reluctant but obedient. As we walked away, I could feel Fyedka's gaze on our backs, could sense his struggle between pursuit and restraint, between pressing his case and respecting boundaries he didn't believe in, but couldn't quite bring himself to violate. The house, when we reached it, thrummed with a tension that had nothing to do with Golda's supposed need for assistance, and everything to do with the crisis we were all trying to navigate without acknowledging. Hodel was at the table with Perchik, their heads bent over a book, but their concentration seemed forced, as though they were performing studiousness rather than actually studying. The younger girls sat in the corner, their usual chatter subdued, their eyes moving between family members with the watchful attention of those who sense drama without understanding its source. "We need to talk," Golda said without preamble once the door was closed. "About Kava, about that boy, about what's happening before it goes too far." "It's already too far," I said, sinking into my chair with the exhaustion of a man who has been fighting a battle he knows he cannot win. They're in love, or think they are, which amounts to the same thing at their age. "Then we must end it," Golda said, with the practical certainty that characterized her approach to all problems. "Send her away. To my sister in Minsk, perhaps, or to—" "I won't be sent away like some wayward child who needs correction," Kava interrupted, and the steel in her voice surprised us all. Our quiet daughter, our dreamer, had found her voice, and it carried an authority we had not expected. "I've done nothing wrong except read books with someone whose company I find stimulating. If that's a crime, then prosecute me for it. But don't exile me for the offense of thinking, of feeling, of being something other than what you planned for me to be." "It's not about plans," I said, though even as I spoke I recognized the weakness of my position. "It's about survival, about maintaining who we are in a world that would be only too happy to see us disappear through assimilation or annihilation." "And who are we, Papa?" Kava asked, and the question carried such genuine curiosity that I found myself momentarily speechless. Are we only our traditions, our prohibitions, our separation from others, or are we also our capacity for growth, for connection, for finding the divine in unexpected places? "Philosophy," Golda muttered, but there was uncertainty in her dismissal, as though she too were beginning to feel the ground shifting beneath our feet. It was Perchik who spoke next, his revolutionary fervor apparently overwhelming his sense of self-preservation. "In the modern world," he began, then stopped as every eye in the room turned to him with varying degrees of hostility. "I'm sorry, but this is exactly what I've been trying to explain. The old boundaries are breaking down everywhere. In the cities, in the universities, Jews and Christians study together, work together, even marry?" I asked sharply. "Is that what you're advocating? The complete dissolution of everything that makes us distinct? Should we be like Sasha, the constable's son, pretending interest in our ways while remaining fundamentally other? Or like Fiedka, caught between worlds, belonging fully to neither?" "I'm advocating," Perchik said carefully, "for the freedom to choose, for the recognition that identity is not just about what we inherit, but also about what we create." "And what would you create?" I asked, though the question was directed more at Kava than at Perchik. "A world without distinctions, without traditions, without the very things that have sustained us through centuries of persecution?" "Perhaps," Hodel said suddenly, and her voice carried a quality I hadn't heard before. Not the passionate certainty of youth, but something more complex, more considered. Perhaps we could create a world where those traditions evolve rather than remain frozen, where they adapt to new realities rather than denying them. "Evolution," I repeated, and the word seemed to contain within it both promise and threat, both hope and fear. "You speak as though tradition were a living thing that could grow and change while remaining essentially itself." "Isn't it?" Kava asked. "Haven't our traditions already evolved? The Judaism we practice is not identical to what Avram practiced, or Moses, or even our great-grandparents, it has adapted, survived, continued by changing just enough to remain relevant while maintaining its essential core. The theological sophistication of her argument surprised me, though perhaps it shouldn't have. This was what came of education, of reading, of exposure to ideas beyond the narrow confines of our village wisdom. My daughter had become a philosopher while I wasn't watching, had developed the intellectual tools to challenge the very foundations I had tried to provide for her. There are some changes that go too far, I said finally. Some adaptations that are not evolution, but extinction. Marrying outside the faith, this is not adaptation, it's surrender. To whom? Kava asked. To love. To the possibility of understanding between peoples. To the hope that the future might be different from the past. To the forces that would see us disappear, I replied. Not through violence, but through dilution, through the gradual erasure of everything that makes us who we are. The argument continued, circular and exhausting, each of us defending positions that were simultaneously reasonable and irreconcilable. It was interrupted, finally, by the arrival of the rabbi, whose appearance at our door was unusual enough to silence our domestic disputation. He stood in our doorway, his ancient frame seeming to carry the weight of centuries, his eyes holding a mixture of compassion and concern that suggested he was aware of our crisis. "Tevye," he said, "I need to speak with you, privately." I followed him outside, leaving behind the heated atmosphere of family conflict for the relatively neutral territory of the street. The rabbi walked slowly, each step deliberate, considered, as though he were measuring not just distance, but meaning. "I've heard things," he said finally, "about your Kava, about the scholar's son." "Nothing has happened," I said quickly. "They've been reading together, talking, but nothing." "Something has happened," he interrupted gently. "Perhaps not what you fear, but something nonetheless. The community is watching, Tevye. They see your daughter with this boy, see the way they look at each other, and they wonder what it means for all of us." "What do they want me to do?" I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. "They want you to be strong," he said simply, "to maintain the boundaries that protect us, to show that even in these changing times, some things remain sacred, inviolate. And if my daughter's heart breaks in the process..." The rabbi was quiet for a long moment, his gaze directed toward the synagogue, that physical manifestation of our communal faith. "Hearts heal," he said finally. "Communities, once fractured, may not. You have a responsibility, Tevye, not just to your daughter, but to all of us, to the past that delivered us here, and to the future that depends on our choices now." The weight of his words settled upon me like a prayer shawl made of lead, simultaneously comforting and crushing. I understood what he was saying, the implicit threat within his gentle words. Maintain the boundaries, or risk becoming an outcast yourself. Your entire family tainted by association with transgression. "I understand," I said, though understanding and accepting were vastly different things. The rabbi nodded and walked away, leaving me standing alone in the street, caught between the house that contained my family's conflict and the village that demanded my compliance with its expectations. Above, the sky had clouded over, the morning sunshine replaced by a gray uncertainty that seemed to mirror my internal weather. When I returned to the house, I found a scene of deceptive normalcy. Kava had retreated to her corner with a book, though I doubted she was actually reading. Hodel and Perchik had resumed their studies with an intensity that suggested they were trying to disappear into the text. Golda was preparing the evening meal with movements that were perhaps more vigorous than necessary, as though she could knead our problems away like air bubbles in dough. The rabbi came, I announced to no one in particular. And? Golda asked, though her tone suggested she already knew. And we have decisions to make, I said. Difficult decisions. They don't have to be difficult, Kava said without looking up from her book. You could simply trust me. Trust that I know my own heart, my own mind. Trust that I wouldn't do anything to bring shame on our family. It's not about trust, I began, but she interrupted. Isn't it? Don't you trust me to make good choices, to consider consequences, to honor my heritage even while expanding my horizons? I trust you, I said slowly, but I also know that love, or what passes for love, can cloud judgment, can make the impossible seem reasonable, the dangerous seem safe. And fear, she countered, can make the reasonable seem impossible, the safe seem dangerous. We had reached an impasse, a moment where words became insufficient to bridge the gap between our positions. The afternoon light was fading, casting long shadows through our windows, and with it came a sense of time running out, of decisions that could not be indefinitely postponed. It was then that Model appeared at our door, my new son-in-law, his face bearing an expression of such distress that all other concerns momentarily fled. Reb Tevye, he said, his voice cracking with emotion. There's news. From the authorities. They're saying all Jews must leave Anatevka. The words fell into our midst like stones into still water, sending ripples of shock through the room. Leave Anatevka? Leave the only home most of us had ever known? When? Golda asked, her practical nature immediately engaging with the logistics of catastrophe. 3 days, Model replied. They're giving us 3 days to pack our lives and go. Go where? Hodel asked, and in her voice I heard not fear, but curiosity, as though this disaster might also be an opportunity. Anywhere, Model said, as long as it's not here. The room erupted in voices, questions, exclamations, denials, but I found myself oddly calm, as though I had been expecting this, as though all our personal dramas had been merely a prelude to this larger catastrophe. We had been arguing about boundaries, about tradition, about the future, and now the future had arrived with brutal clarity, sweeping away our small concerns with the violence of historical inevitability. Well, I said finally, my voice cutting through the chaos, it seems the decision has been made for us. We're all leaving. The question is not whether traditions will be maintained, but whether we'll survive at all. I looked at Kava, saw the devastation in her face as she realized what this meant, not just exile from our home, but separation from Fiedka, perhaps forever. The tragedy of young love interrupted by historical forces seemed suddenly small against the larger tragedy of an entire community uprooted. But I could see that for her, the personal catastrophe was the only one that mattered. 3 days, I repeated, tasting the timeline of our destruction. 3 days to pack centuries of existence. 3 days to say goodbye to everything we've known. 3 days to become refugees in our own lives. The fiddler on the roof, I thought, would have to find a new roof, a new precarious perch, from which to play his eternal melody. We would all have to find new balance in a world that had suddenly tilted beyond recognition. The arguments about tradition and change, about boundaries and bridges, seemed almost quaint now, philosophical luxuries we could no longer afford. Yet even as I contemplated our impending exile, I couldn't help but wonder if this too was part of some larger pattern, some divine choreography that we could only understand in retrospect. We had been debating whether traditions could evolve, whether boundaries could be crossed, whether love could transcend difference. Now we would discover whether we could survive at all, whether our traditions were portable, whether our identity could withstand not just change, but complete displacement. We should start packing, Golda said, ever practical even in the face of catastrophe. 3 days is not much time. No, I agreed. It's not. But as my family dispersed to begin the impossible task of compressing our lives into whatever we could carry, I found myself thinking, not about what we would take, but about what we would leave behind. Not just possessions, but possibilities. Not just places, but the future we had imagined in this place. Kava's crisis, which had seemed so momentous this morning, was now subsumed into a larger crisis that affected us all. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that the two were somehow connected, that the personal and the historical were intertwined in ways I couldn't quite articulate. We were being forced to leave because we were Jews, because our very existence here was suddenly deemed unacceptable by forces beyond our control. Kava wanted to cross boundaries that our tradition deemed unacceptable. Both involved questions of identity, of belonging, of the price we pay for being who we are. The evening came with its familiar rhythms despite the extraordinary circumstances. Prayers were said, though with perhaps more fervor than usual. Dinner was served, though appetites were considerably diminished. Candles were lit, though their light seemed fragile against the darkness that was descending upon us. Through it all, I watched my family, these people I loved more than life itself, and wondered what would become of us, scattered to the winds like seeds from a dandelion, hoping to find new soil in which to root, but knowing that not all seeds find fertile ground. "Papa," Kava approached me as the others prepared for bed, her voice soft but determined. "What if Fyedka could help us? His family has connections, resources. They're also leaving, but they have options we don't. What if what? I asked, though I knew where this was leading. What if we accepted help from them? What if we traveled together? What if this catastrophe became an opportunity for you to pursue what you couldn't pursue here?" She didn't deny it, couldn't deny it. In her eyes, I saw hope and guilt warring with each other, the desire for her own happiness conflicting with the recognition of our collective tragedy. "I want to help the family," she said, "but You also want him," I finished. "I know, but Kava, even in exile, especially in exile, we must maintain who we are. Otherwise, we're not surviving. We're disappearing." She looked at me for a long moment, and in her gaze I saw something shift, harden, resolve into a determination that frightened me more than tears would have. "Then perhaps," she said quietly, "disappearing is better than surviving without really living." She walked away before I could respond, leaving me with her words echoing in the silence. Outside, I could hear the sounds of a community in crisis, voices raised in discussion, the crash of objects being moved, the tears of those contemplating loss. The fiddler on the roof had stopped playing, or perhaps I simply could no longer hear him over the symphony of sorrow that was enveloping our village. 3 days. We had 3 days to end one life and begin another, to close this chapter of our existence and hope there would be another to follow. 3 days to resolve the irresolvable, to pack the unpackable, to say goodbyes that might be forever. Lord, I said to the darkness, your sense of timing leaves much to be desired. Just when I'm struggling with one crisis, you provide another to make the first seem trivial. Is this your way of teaching perspective, or merely your reminder that we control far less than we think we do? The darkness, predictably, provided no answer, but somewhere in the distance, faint but unmistakable, I heard the sound of a fiddle playing, not the joyous dance of celebration, nor the bitter keen of lamentation, but something in between, a melody that spoke of ending and beginning, of loss and possibility, of tradition and change, all woven together in a complexity that no single emotion could encompass. We would leave Anatevka. We would become wanderers, refugees, seekers of new homes in a world that might or might not welcome us. We would carry our traditions with us like seeds, hoping to plant them in new soil, and somehow, through it all, we would maintain our balance, like the fiddler on his roof, playing our music, despite the precariousness of our position, creating meaning from melody, finding harmony in discord, dancing on the edge of existence with whatever grace we could muster. The night deepened around our house, around our village, around our ending world. But morning would come, as it always did, and with it the work of transformation, the labor of becoming something new while remaining essentially ourselves. It would be the hardest dance we had ever attempted, but we would attempt it nonetheless, because the alternative was to stop dancing altogether, and that was the one thing we could never do, not while the music continued, not while breath remained, not while hope, however faint, still played its eternal melody in our hearts. Thanks for spending some time with me tonight. I hope I helped you unwind and drift a little closer to sleep. If you're enjoying these readings, there's a whole library of full books and cozy chapters waiting for you over on my Patreon. If you are already a member, then I thank you. It includes exclusive content, bonus episodes, and early access to new releases. You can also become a YouTube member if you haven't already, to listen ad-free and explore hundreds of other relaxing readings anytime you like. I'd love to have you there. Sweet dreams, and I'll see you in the next one.